being from an environmental organization, I'm an environmentalist, and I thought I would talk today about climate resiliency. So I'm sure that you have seen these images from Superstorm Sandy from a few years ago. And maybe you, well, this one, this is in New Jersey, and this is something that should never happen. And hopefully, with the experiences that we've been through from Hurricane Katrina and Rita through Sandy and Irene, we can come up with some ideas to avoid this in the future so that it doesn't happen in Massachusetts. Storm surges, sea level rise, flooding, they're going to be with us for generations, and it's important for us now to be preparing for our progeny, our children, our grandchildren, who are going to have to deal with this. Not only will we be experiencing storm surges and extreme flooding and things like that, but we're also going to be experiencing extreme heat. Some of these things we're already experiencing. And so we have these images, but of course we all remember this, last year's big snow. And I learned several important lessons during the big snow. I had a health emergency that started, you'll remember the big snow started basically on Super Bowl Sunday. And I had this nerve problem that got really bad, and I needed to get to the hospital. Do you think about going to the hospital unless you're pregnant or you have something like that? But I had a hard time really thinking clearly and figuring out, A, that I needed to go to the hospital, and B, that how was I going to get there? And at the time, I had a very tiny car, a Fiat 500, and even if I could have dug that car out, there's no way that I would have been able to drive it through the snow. And these are some of the things, health emergencies and things like that, that we need to think about as a society and as a community, and how are we going to deal with this as this continues to happen. And how we function as a society and how we collaborate as a society is going to define what the built environment looks like in the future. In Massachusetts, we're blessed with a really beautiful natural environment, and this is one of them. I think somehow maybe I should have put up a picture of the Charles River, because we do a lot of work on the Charles. But anyway, no matter how prepared that we think we are, we're never prepared enough. So climate change is impacting our natural environment as well as our built environment. For waterfront communities, we're talking about sea level rise of the ocean, of our flooding, our rivers and streams, and inland communities as well. Some of the work that we're working on at CLF contemplates some of those emergencies that we're going to be having. For example, what do you do when you have a petroleum tank farm that's lying at low level in a floodplain? Communities like Chelsea and Everett are beginning to think about what's going to happen should sea level rise affect these tank farms and pollute their communities, creating an imminent and substantial endangerment, which is a legal word, and I think that that's all of the legalese that I put in my presentation. But we're also working with a community in Saugus that is dealing with an unlined ash landfill that is in a floodplain that could imminently impact Saugus, Revere, Lynn, low and middle income communities. This is also going to affect, well, here's our built environment. And this is right here in Worcester. And when I saw this picture, I looked at how much paved surface there is. Now, in Massachusetts, we're not as bad as some places in terms of impervious surfaces. I was in Houston last year, and I was amazed to see that I couldn't see a patch of green the entire time that I was there. And it's no wondering that we have this severe flooding right now in Texas. What this overpaving does as well, though, is that it creates stormwater runoff. And stormwater runoff have things like petroleum and phosphorus that go into our waterways and our rivers. And when the extreme heat arrives, we also have the growth of cyanobacteria, which is that blue-green algae. Now, there have been studies out there that link blue-green algae to neurological diseases, Alzheimer's, and a lot of parents are thinking about whether or not they want their children out there boating on the Charles River, whether they want their dogs swimming in Jamaica Pond. We haven't really evaluated the dangers. But, and so that's something that to think about in our built environment, and how can we create infrastructure that really does allow for stormwater runoff to go back into the watershed. In addition to that, though, climate change is going to affect our real estate, our building, our design, and also our financing program. Some families have flood insurance from the National Flood Insurance Program, which is increasing around 18% annually. How many people can afford that? Or what if you're in a situation where you really do have to take aid from FEMA, emergency funding from FEMA? A lot of us think about that as a big relief that that money is available for us. But some studies have shown that if you take FEMA money, you're automatically going to have trouble selling your home. It shouldn't be that way. There are other things that we need to think about. I heard a statistic from one of my colleagues at the CLF's Rhode Island office that 9 out of 10 Rhode Islanders own a car. What that means is that, well, a couple of things. Only the poorest people take public transportation in Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, the transportation is poorly funded, and you can imagine, since there aren't that many people advocating for it. But what it also means for us here in Massachusetts and in Connecticut is that these Rhode Islanders are going to be in their cars, and they're going to be going to Connecticut and Massachusetts. And if any of you drove here today like I do, you know that we've already got enough cars here. These are things for us to be thinking about as a region. But in addition to that, we should be thinking about, people who can't afford to have air conditioning. Where are our cooling centers? Are we building cooling centers? Can people get to them? Are they near retirement homes where older people or sick people might be? Are they on transit lines? And finally, just kind of crystallizing that a lot of the impacts are disproportionate. And our economy. I wanted to mention the economy because during the big snow last year, a lot of people couldn't get to work. Some of those people were tea operators, workers who couldn't get to work, which meant that the tea wasn't working. Some of those people were hourly wage workers whose restaurants or stores didn't open up. We really need to think about how climate change is impacting us holistically as an organism, and the economy is a big part of it, and it's something that I think that we can all agree needs to be addressed. So this slide I got from our friends at MAPC. So thank you, MAPC. I thought that this slide really laid out very well how climate mitigation, adaptation, and smart growth fit together. And when I speak of climate mitigation, I mean reducing our carbon footprint, reducing our carbon emissions. You heard Andre mention in introducing me about this big case under the State's Global Warming Solutions Act, where DEP is going to be issuing regulations that reduce our greenhouse gases annually. Those things are climate mitigation. sustainable, affordable transit, renewable energy, energy efficiency, which we're number one in the country, but we can also do better, particularly in the commercial and industrial sectors. We have an opportunity as new businesses come into Massachusetts, as we inch towards passing our zoning reform legislation. How can we think about climate resiliency and building a state and local communities that can bounce back? How do we incorporate green infrastructure like green rooftops and rain gardens and other stormwater management systems? How do we accurately price climate risk so that insurance is affordable? Smart growth is a big answer to that. Smart growth, sustainable transportation, creative design, limiting growth, building houses up a little bit higher, master planning. But above all, it's important to engage the people who are living it, engage our local communities. I certainly hope to engage in planning processes where I can talk about my own personal experience of trying to get to the hospital. Local communities can look at their 1 mile radius, when you're living in your 1 mile radius that Dan mentioned, to think about things incrementally, to assess their neighborhoods, to define what needs to be done, and to plan and implement. And that's where I think we're going in Massachusetts. It's a very exciting time, particularly if a few pieces of legislation pass in this term: zoning reform, the climate adaptation management plan, which will be a real game changer, and of course the Global Warming Solutions Act regulations. So I wish you a really good day at this conference. I'm looking forward to it, and I know there's some really interesting panels. So thanks for having me this morning.